Hi, everybody. It's great to see so many people here. So first of all, welcome to my studio. I'm going to give you a brief outline of what we're going to do today. I am going to show you around my studio a little bit and show you some of my tools. Then I'm going to show you some examples of traditional and non-traditional bookbinding. And then we're going to do a little project together. So I'm really excited about this and I hope you are too. So bookbinding, traditional bookbinding uses a variety of materials. Often fancy bindings are done, which are called fine bindings, are called with made with leather and parchment. And some books are also made with cloth and with paper, covering the outside of the book. So I'm going to show you around. So the first thing that is the most important tool for a bookbinder is a press. So this is a huge bookbinding press that I made myself, and this crank can apply 300 pounds of pressure in here to books or paper that I'm trying to flatten. I also do some woodworking, so I have some saws. This over here is a hot stamping machine, and this is used to create lettering, sometimes in gold, sometimes in other metallic foils, on books. It heats up and you set the type, which I'll show you in a moment, in there, and you can stamp the books. This over here is called a board shear or a board chopper. The covers of a book are made of really heavy and incredibly dense cardboard. And in order to cut them cleanly, you need a really big blade. So this it's got a 27-inch blade here. It's also really useful for cutting paper. And for people who received the kit, all the paper was cut to size on the board chopper. Then here we have a variety of hand tools, just meaning sort of non-electronic things you hold in your hand. These are also for making designs. These are brass wheels for making designs out of gold and foils on leather or cloth. And this here is used for thinning leather, so it's the right thickness so that you can bind a book with it. And sitting over here is my herd of goats. Most of the leather that is used now for bookbinding is goat leather, and it's usually originates in Africa and then is processed primarily in Europe nowadays, and comes in a variety of colors, dyed and undyed. And so, yeah, those are my goats. And occasionally calf too. People use calf for rebinding old books, and occasionally for making new books. Calf skin is very smooth, particularly compared to goat skin. So, and I wanted to show you the type. So in order to create the lettering on parchment or leather or paper or cloth, you need metal type. And each letter is on a separate piece of metal. So this is a lowercase r. And these are made out of lead. They're either made from lead or brass. And the measurement is the same as the measurements on your computer. So 12 points or 14 points is the original type of typographic measurement for how tall a letter is. And just like just like how you can set the leading on your computer, which is the space between the lines, that originates from when the space between the lines was made out of bars of lead. So here, there are different thicknesses, and you can stack them on top of each other to make space between the lines of text. So for hot stamping, people either use lead or they use brass. In traditional printing, people use lead. And yes, the lead type is the same as letterpress type. It's also very easy lead is very soft. So it doesn't last as long as brass, but it's much cheaper and easier to produce, and you can much more easily melt it down and make new type. And lead, although it can be really dangerous when you put it in your mouth, touching it is not dangerous as long as you wash your hands. It doesn't get into the air in the same way that if you have chips or like little bits of lead paint, the worry is that you breathe it in. But working with lead, as long as you're careful, is not that dangerous. So those are some of the tools that I use. And now I'm going to start by showing you 2 books that were passed down in my family. One of the interesting things is that Jewish bookbinding, as with like synagogue design and Judaica design and music, has sort of followed trends in the broader bookbinding world. The sort of heyday of bookbinding was the mid-1800s, and it was in the early to middle of the 20th century when hand bookbinding sort of got replaced by mechanical bookbinding. So I'm going to show you 2 books that are sidurim, that are prayer books that have been in my family and are really interesting from a bookbinding perspective. So my family is Spanish and Portuguese, and so these are Spanish and Portuguese books. This is a daily and occasional prayers, and this is what's called a limp leather binding, meaning that the cover is soft. It's stamped on the spine. This is like the hot stamping with the lettering in gold. And along the edge of the inside, I don't know if you can see that, there's a pattern that's made with a wheel, like I showed you on the pegboard, and gold. And these end papers, meaning the pages inside the cover, the very first pages, are marbled. And marbling is where you take inks and you suspend them. You use the different viscosities to suspend them over a bath of water, and then you can swirl the inks around and then lay a piece of paper on it and essentially print using that. Another interesting thing about this book is that the edges are gilt using gold leaf. Nowadays, when you see gilt edges, unless it's a really expensive book, it was probably either spray painted or done with a foil. But back in the day, these were done with it's a very labor-intensive process of laying gold leaf and adhering it to the edges of the pages. So that's one book. And I'll just show you, this one is also a Spanish and Portuguese prayer book. This kind of design you probably are very familiar with. It's this sort of decorative patterns. These are done with hand tools, which are, you heat up the tool and then you press it into the leather. So, for example, this is a tool. This is a hand tool that I made. It's very simple. It's just a dot, forming, like shaping the metal is kind of challenging. So it's kind of niche. I mean, what isn't in bookbinding? So you heat something like this up on a stove, and then you either use a foil or you use an adhesive that adheres the gold leaf to the leather, and it's heat activated. So wherever you press the tool, the gold sticks to the leather. So now I'm going to show you a couple of, sorry, are there any questions about this so far? I realize I'm just talking and talking.
And if folks have questions, they can use the virtual raise hand function or put your question in the chat or let me know in the chat that you have a question and we'll get you unmuted.
Could you use a soldering tool to impress a design in the leather? So yes and no. There's some people who do what's called free-form tooling, where you can use a foil and create a shape with the soldering tool. The difficulty is that the tooling is leather is incredibly sensitive. It is, after all, skin, and so the space between enough heat to make the gold stick and have the impression and too much heat that you actually burn the leather is a very small range. And so it's a little tricky to use a soldering tool, but worth a try. There's always room for experimentation. So I'm going to show you a couple of books that I've bound. The first I'm going to show you, this is just similar to the old Sidurim in the style. So this is a book that I bound of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And it's a leather-bound book, so it's completely leather. And the upper edge is gilt with gold leaf in that very labor-intensive process. And I used a tool to create an impression of the shape on what's called the head edge, which means the top of the board. The top of the book. And you can also see that the end bands, which are under here, that are sometimes striped or made of fabric or string, in this case are hand sewn with silk. And so what I did here is I started by cutting out all these different, I dyed all these shades of leather, and then I cut them into a pattern, and I adhered them. And then I decided to, I wanted some different textures. So I used sanding and some tooling to create more texture on this. And I typeset and printed this book myself. So I printed the text block, and the text block refers to the pages of the book. And secondly, what I'm going to show you, so this is a Siddur that I bound. So I used a Koren Siddur and I redid the binding. So I took off the covers and I redid it. And it's a parchment binding. And what I did is I used a land deed. Back in the 19th century and earlier, land deeds and wills were written on parchment, and they're very large. They're about this big, and it was essentially for all important documents were written on parchment for quite some while, and to this day, I believe the British Parliament writes all they're the biggest client for parchment in the world because all their laws, once codified, are written on parchment. So I took this land deed, and you can see some of the design. So this red line was original to the land deed, and you can see some of the writing. And then I used a method called frottage, where I on a die cutter, I cut out all these letters of one of the Psalms from Friday night, and I adhered it in vinyl to the back of the parchment, and I sanded it away so that where you see the letters, it's darker just because it's thinner. The parchment is thinner there, and you can see the backing paper that I backed the parchment with coming through. And another thing that I did on this book that's kind of interesting, well, I think it's interesting, before books were stored upright on a shelf the way we store them, they were first stored on their sides like this. And because of that, what showed was that head edge, that top of the book. And so when you look at really, really old books, the titles are written on the pages on the top, not on the spine, the way we do it now. And so I've been thinking about this, and although writing the title is not necessarily super practical, I think it's a really interesting place to put words. So on this particular one, I used a verse, Adonai Sfatai Tiftach Ufi Yagiti Latacha, that's said at the beginning of the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, which is that may God open my lips and I will say his praises, or God's praises. So I put that verse on the head edge. And actually I made a stencil for this and then used paint. And the stencil was made with a font that I designed that is based on a Spanish and Portuguese manuscript that has been in my family. That is a manuscript of Birkat HaMazon, the Grace After Meals. And I've digitized it and created a font so that I can do other things in the handwriting of that scribe. So those are a couple of books. Do you guys want to see one more book I made? Or do we want to start the project? Okay, it looks like people want to see one more thing. So this is a set of 3 little books. They're tiny. Look, here's my hand. They're smaller than my hand. And this is the story of the Arabian Nights that I found in a very sweet used bookstore. And this book has little illustrations that are prints throughout the 3 volumes. It's a 3-volume set. So what I did is I scanned these tiny little etchings because they're so dramatic. I don't know if you can see this, but these people have exciting lives. So I scanned them and I created photographic negatives out of the etchings. And then I used a process called cyanotype printing, where you put a light-sensitive emulsion on a piece of paper and you expose it to the sun. Some people have fancy UV lights, but I like trying my luck with the sun. This is a summer-only project for me, at least. And wherever the light hits the paper, wherever the negative hasn't blocked it out, it sets. And when you wash it in water afterwards, it stays really dark where the light hit it. So what I did is I created, you can see here's one scene from this book. And each one has, the cover is bound with a cyanotype which is also, cyanotype is a very early photographic process. So each one is bound in a cyanotype with images from the book. And on the end papers, I used a different kind of gold leaf. This is a cyanotype of some of the text from the pages. So I will show you. Volume 1 has a standard colored warm gold leaf. Volume 2 has what's called red gold leaf. And volume 3 has moon gold, which is has a slightly cooler tone. And each of these are created by mixing the gold before it's beaten into a very flat sheet with a different combination of of metals. So these are all, gold leaf is pretty expensive, not because there's a lot of gold in it, because it's so incredibly thin, but because the process of beating it is very labor intensive. And you can rip it if you breathe on it. It can, in the wrong way, it can rip. I'm not joking. That's not an exaggeration. Each of these volumes, because it is a set of 3, I have on the head edge, I have the number of the volume, and on the bottom, I just have a little bit of design that when you put them all flat, has this little arcing pattern. So, and also, sorry, one last thing. If you can see the head caps for this, I sewed with silk, and one has 1 white band, 2 has 2 white bands, and the 3rd volume has 3 white bands in the headband. So those are some of my recent bookbinding projects. So there is so much to learn in bookbinding, and it's a really exciting place in the world. There's a lot of, it's all about balancing old traditions and old materials with making things that are really, really new. In my opinion, although I'm very impressed by people who can do recreations of things done 200 years ago, in my work, I like to ask the question, like, what can I do, not despite the fact that I'm living in the 21st century, but because I'm living in the 21st century? And how can I bring these traditions and my experience into the modern day? Someone asked, is the bottom the foot edge? The bottom is called the tail edge. So you have a head and a tail. Yeah, kind of funky. Some of these terms are incredibly, incredibly old. I don't know exactly when people started referring to the head and the tail, but I know that those terms are at least like 500 years old. So yeah. Someone asked what brought me to bookbinding. So I grew up in a family where everybody reads and everybody loves texts and everyone loves books. And I had difficulty reading as a child. And so I became sort of more interested in how a book looks and feels and how lettering looks and feels, because I was also interested in books, but found the reading difficult. And as I progressed through school and to university, I became interested in the philosophical questions about, like, where is the information in a book stored? Is it in our minds? Is it just in the text? How do we grapple with the relationship between the text and the books? And I've always loved working with my hands and doing art and working with paper. So I discovered the land of bookbinding, and it was hard to say no. So that it kind of was a convergence of a lot of things that I'm interested in. Are people excited for a project? Okay, excellent. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do what is called a pamphlet stitch. I'm going to show you with the kit that I sent out. If you don't have the kit, that's totally fine. You can still follow along, and these things all still apply. And what we're going to be making, I wanted to do, when you learn bookbinding in bookbinding school, you start by making blank notebooks for months, like months. So here are some of the first books that I made. They're totally blank and not that useful. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to do a project that would also be meaningful and people could use. So I typeset for you guys the blessings on Friday night, and I thought that we could put this little booklet together, and then if you want to use it, you can use it at a Friday night Shabbat meal. So, okay, let me get this set up. One moment. Here we go. And I will show you what we got. Okay. So you should have a little brown bag that looks like this, that has in it some string, a needle, and the needle with a little bit of, with a little diagram of what we're going to do, a label for the front, and then you're going to have what in this case is our text block, the pages of our book, and a piece of paper for the cover. So I already folded the cover in half once for you, but we're gonna start by folding the text block and fitting it into the cover. So one thing to note is that what we're going to do is we're going to fold the text block in half. There should be a blank page on the outside. So one page before you see the Friday night blessings. You want the blank page on the outside, and you want the page that has Shalom Aleichem in Hebrew and English on the inside. Yes, so in terms of turning the PDF printout into the text block, print the PDF double-sided with the binding on the long side. Printers usually have an option for that. And then what you should have is 2 booklets, one on top of each other. Cut the paper in half vertically, and you'll have what we have here. So there should be 4 sheets of paper. Starting from the front, you should have a completely blank piece. Then one that says Friday Night Blessings. I'm keeping these in order, it's kind of important. And then one that on the left side has a Abraham Joshua Heschel quote. And then one which says on the left side, blessing for candle lighting. So that together are all the pages. Now, I'm going to show you how to fold this. For bookbinders, there's a very particular way to fold things. And I'm going to show you a little tool that's kind of cool, but we're going to do this just with our fingers. So these are called bone folders. These 2 I bought, this one I made. And what these are used for pressing down on a fold to get a really crisp fold. And I can show you, the reason they're called bone folders is because they're made of bone. So it depends, and there are lots of different types of bone folders depending on how flexible you want it to be. So here, I'm going to show you, this is an elk bone. It's very large, and you can see the marrow, I think that's called the marrow, on the inside. And this is one that I haven't yet made into a bone folder, but you do this with a lot of rasps and a lot of woodworking tools to create it into a shape. But this is I believe this is an elk rib because it's fairly flexible. That is for a bone. You can put a little bit of pressure on it. So, but instead of a bone folder, what we're going to do is we're just going to use our fingers. So I'm going to turn it over so that the Shalom Aleichem is up. I'm going to fold it across, making sure that to the extent possible, the edges here line up. I'm going to hold it down with one hand, and with the other hand, I'm going to start in the center and then press out like that. So this is the point that some people would use a bone folder just to, you can also use the back of a spoon, but I think your fingers are just fine, or if you want to use your fingernail. So here we have our pages folded. Now what we're going to do is we're going to open it back up and we're going to fit it into the center of our book, of our cover. And you'll notice that the cover is a little bit larger. Well, it's larger width-wise, but it's a little bit higher than the text block. This little area here is usually called the square. I have no idea why, but having the cover extend beyond the text block helps us protect the pages with the cover, which is a little bit stronger. So now I've got my needle in my hand. Holding these together, and if you are working on a table which is which you don't want to scratch, you might want to put something under this while you do this. I'm going to poke 3 holes, and I'm going to poke the holes through in the center of the, like in the fold, through both the pages and the cover. And the holes I'm going to poke are going to be, one is going to be in the middle, and then the other one is going to be like about 1/2 inch or like a centimeter. I know those aren't the same. 1.5 centimeters, 1/2 inch from the edges. Okay, does that make sense? So I'm going to go ahead and make sure as you do this that it went all the way through. Great. So now I have my holes. And now it is time to do some sewing. So I'm gonna explain this as we go, but if it's confusing, you can look at this diagram. And this diagram, this is sort of a, I guess, a bookbinder notation, but these little loops here, these 3 circles, those are the holes that we just made. Okay? So I will show you how to do it, but this, you can also follow this little diagram. So this, I am going to now thread my needle. This is what's called 12-3, which is the thickness, linen bookbinding thread. So it's 100% linen, which is incredibly strong. So I'm going to thread my needle just like this. Is everybody with me? Yes? Okay. And I'm going to begin on the outside. So I'm going to start in the center, and I'm going to go in from the outside. And I'm going to pull the string, not all the way through, I'm going to leave a bit of a tail, but I'm going to pull most of the string through. And now I'm going to flip it over because my string is now coming out the center. Okay, I'm going to give everybody a moment. Okay, and now I'm going to go out one of the other holes on the side. So I've essentially created a stitch that goes from the center to one of the sides. And I'm going to pull this through. Okay, so I have a loop on the inside now. And on the outside, I have the short tail coming from the center and the long tail coming from the side. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in the other hole. So I'm skipping the center hole and I'm going to the other hole. My pages got a little out of alignment. Here we go. And I'm going to go back to the center. Dropped my needle. Through the top hole. So now I'll pull this through and show you what we've got. So what we have here is what you should have is the string coming out the center and a span of thread going from one side to the other. Okay, now I'm going to go back. Here we have the center of the book. And I have a stitch on one side, and then the string is coming out the other. And I'm going to go back into the center. Sorry, out of the center. Going from the center of the book, going from the inside of the book, back out to the center. Back out to the cover. My apologies. So what I've got is on the inside, I have 2 stitches going from the sides to the center. And on the outside, I have 1 long stitch that extends across all of them. And I have 2 strings coming out. Okay. Now, one thing that's a little bit important here, but not very tricky, we'll figure this out, is that what I want ideally is I want 1 string coming out on one end, coming out on either side of the string that goes across. If both of yours are on one side, you can just use the needle and bring it over to the other side. Okay, so here, I don't know if you can see this, but the way I want to imagine it is that there's this geyser of thread going in 2 directions and a bridge going through the geyser. Okay. Okay, now this is the point at which you could tie this, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but I'm just going to go back and show you this process again, just for review, and then we'll tie it. So I'm just going to take out my stitching. And we'll go back. So this is going to be a little bit faster this time, but I hope it'll still be helpful. I'm going to start on the outside and go into the center. And I'm pulling most of the thread through. Then I flip it over. And I'm going to go out back to the cover on one of the holes on the side. So now I have 1 stitch spanning half of the booklet on the inside. And on the outside, I have the short end coming out the middle and the long end coming out the side. Now I'm going to go all the way across the booklet and go back into the center of the book on the other side. So when I pull it taut, I have a big stitch going across and one string coming out. And now I've flipped it over, so I have the same thing on the inside. What I have on the inside is one stitch spanning half the booklet and one string coming out. So I'm going to go then from the inside, I'm going to go out the center here. Which leaves me with 2 stitches on the inside, each going from out to in. And on the outside, I have 2 ends and a stitch spanning the whole book. Now what I'm going to do is, just using the needle, I'm going to make sure that each of the strings are on one side of the big stitch. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to do is, now it's time to tie it. So I'm going to take my needle off just to reduce the chance of stabbing myself. And Zadie, yes, it's, if you want to, when you go, the question is, when you go back through the center, do you want to be careful not to go through the thread? Yes, it's best to go around the thread. And if that's feeling challenging, one thing you can do is, as you make that last stitch, you can hold the thread out of the way to the side as you pull the needle through, so you don't pierce the thread with your needle. In this case, if you have gone through the thread, I recommend just taking the needle off, pulling the stitch out from the other side, and putting the needle back on. So now what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to tie a square knot here. So I'm going to tie it like I'm tying my shoelaces. I'm going to go over and under, and I'm going to pull it tight. And then I'm going to do that again, so that it doesn't go anywhere. Now, if you want, you can tie it into a bow, like I have on this one. Or you can use a pair of scissors. You don't need gigantic shears like these. You can use any scissors to just clip off any excess thread. Okay, so now we have the sewing done, which is really exciting. Okay, so now the last thing we're gonna do, well, actually, this is not the last thing. The next thing we're gonna do is, we're gonna flip the booklet over, over on the inside. Someone asked what are the dimensions of the booklet. So the text block is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 when folded. So what we're going to do is, this cardstock, it's thicker than the paper, but we still want to give this book and this cover a little more oomph. So what we're going to do is, we're going to take, I'm going to show you. We're going to take the side, the edge of the paper, and we're going to fold it in to the inside, just shy of the sewing, so that to double the thickness, okay? So I'm going to fold it just shy of the sewing here. And again, I'm going to press it with my finger on in the center and move towards the outside. So now I have double thickness on one side and the same, and what we had before on the other. Someone asked, if you tie a bow, do you recommend double knotting the bow? I double knot it first with a square knot to make sure that it won't come undone. And then I And then I just tie the bow regularly. If it comes out, then it's just decorative and you can retie the bow and it won't affect the book if you have a double knot underneath it. And so now, okay, so I have one side folded and now I'm going to do the other one. I'm going to fold it almost to the center of the sewing, press down on in the center to the outside. And here's our little booklet. And now, one thing that you don't have to do, but you can do, is in order to make the cover feel more cohesive with the booklet, the text block, what you can do is you can tuck that blank page we had on the outside, you can tuck it into the inside of the cover. So I'm going to do that on both sides, so that when you open the book, the first thing you see is Friday Night Blessings. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the very last thing that we're going to do, if you want, you can put a dab of glue here and here and glue that page into the cover. You don't need to use a lot of glue, just a little bit to keep it in place. Or you can keep it as is so that you can show all your friends virtually how you made this book. In other words, it's an open structure book, which means that by looking at it, you can see all the aspects of the structure of the book and the way the book is made. So now, I have it here, and I'm looking at the front cover. I designed this book to go in the Hebrew direction. So the spine is on the right side, and it opens on the left side. So I'm looking at the front cover. Now, for bookbinding, we usually use, let me pause, how to fold the cover. So what we're gonna, when you wanna fold the cover, take the edge of the paper and fold it in so that it's towards the center of the booklet. So it's just shy of the sewing, and press down. So the cover is, I cut the covers so that they're designed to be, well, double and a little bit so that you have, again, your square, the area around the text block on all three sides of the text block. So now I have this. So for bookbinding, people use a variety of adhesives. For leather and people use wheat paste, which is a glue made by cooking down a refined wheat starch. It looks like flour, but it's much smoother and has, and you cook it into this clear paste. Or people use animal adhesives like hide glue, but primarily people use what's called PVA, polyvinyl acetate. And that is a plastic-based glue, which is the main PVA is the main ingredient in Elmer's glue. So what I use is just a acid-free refined version of Elmer's glue. Acid eats away at natural materials over time, so if you want your booklet to last 100 years, you should probably find some acid-free glue. Otherwise, if it doesn't have to last hundreds of years, any glue you have is fine. So what I'm going to use, we're going to adhere the label, which has the title of the book. And what I'm going to use is a glue stick. This is an acid-free Japanese glue stick. You can also use any glue stick you have. or any glue. If you're using glue, either you want to put a very light coat on, so either use your fingers or a paintbrush to apply the glue. In this case, I'm going to use this glue stick. I'm using a piece of paper. You can use the diagram with the pamphlet stick. You want to get it all, the glue all the way to the edges so that they don't come up. So I'm going to apply the glue all the way around the edges and down the center. Now this is the key. The number of times I've done things to books and found out afterwards that they were permanent and backwards is tremendous. Every bookbinder has things that are titled backwards or upside down. So make sure that your label is the right way up. And I'm gonna place it right in the middle of my booklet. And I'm gonna smooth it down with my hands. You can also use a bone folder. You can also put it under 300 pounds of pressure if you want, if you have 300 pounds of pressure. Hopefully you don't have 300 pounds of mental pressure, just physical pressure. And there we have it. There is our booklet. If it feels wet, and one interesting way that you can test if it feels damp is if it feels cool, because I'm sure there's a biologist or a chemist who can explain to me why, but things that are damp feel cool to the touch. If it feels cooler than other paper, one thing you can do to prevent it from buckling is put a piece of paper over it to protect it and put a big book on top of it. So here's some bookbinding weights. This is a wooden weight with lead shot in the middle that I made, and I put bees on top of because I like bees. This is what's called an L weight that is made of some kind of metal that weighs 7.5 pounds for box making and bookbinding. Here is my weight of choice, a book about Hebrew calligraphy. So any book will do. And I'm just gonna leave it under, if it feels damp, you can leave it under the book for a couple hours. And then once it's dry, you can use your little booklet. Hello, everybody. Does anyone have any other questions about this project, or about bookbinding, or about what crazy things you can do with a huge press?
I have a request, which is if folks want to hold up their booklet if they made one and get a screenshot. That was so cool. Thanks. Someone asked what card is, what the dimensions of the cardstock are.
It's listed on the workshop page on My Jewish Learning. It's 6 by I can look it up, but it's on the workshop thing, and I can tell you exactly the dimensions. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head.
Marianne, did you have a question?
I do. Okay, this is kind of silly, but maybe. So my dad, who is still alive, he's 91, was in the Korean War. And I have the 2 prayer books that he had when he, well, I don't know why there's 2, but they're daily prayers, abridged for Jews in the Armed Forces of the United States. You can see I've masking taped the covers to get, oh, that one just fell off. And it's just very fine pages, but for sentimentality or just to preserve it, is there anything that you would recommend that I could do to them? They're kind of a faux, I don't know what, dog hide? I don't know what you call it. Not even that heavy.
Totally. That's so awesome and so beautiful that you have them. The first thing that I think is important, if possible, don't put tape on them, especially don't use duct tape.
But yeah.
Duct tape has adhesive that's really hard to remove. But a big area of bookbinding is book repair. And you can have them repaired by a bookbinder. Another option that people sometimes do is you can also get a box made for it, so that, which doesn't necessarily, it helps, or a fancy way of saying a box is a protective enclosure. So you can get a protective enclosure made that will prevent any damage to the book, and you can keep the box on your shelf as well. So that's another option.
Like a phone case.
Yeah, like a phone case, or like a fancy dictionary that comes in a case.
Yeah.
That sort of things.
All right. Well, I'll see. I might email you with another question about it.
Sure, I'm always around.
Okay.
Does anyone else?
Questions? Can you make boxes out of bookboard?
Yes, I believe that is a statement. Boxes, so the standard kind of box for bookbinding is a clamshell box, which I don't want to go sorting through stuff to waste everyone's time, but it's made of a very sturdy cardboard, which is the bookboard that the covers of a book are made from.
Great.
And
go ahead. Was there another question?
I just wanted to say one thing about the paper. So the paper is from the Strathmore brand. It's called laid paper, and laid means that you can see the lines of how the paper was made in the paper, which means not totally smooth. So that's what that is. I just thought it was nice. I like laid paper.